14-year-old Christian Fernandez stood before Circuit Judge Mallory Cooper in the Duval County Courthouse in Jacksonville, Florida, on March 20th, 2013, wearing an orange juvenile detention jumpsuit that hung loosely on his small frame, his face displaying the defiant scowl that had become his trademark expression throughout the legal proceedings, as Judge Cooper prepared to sentence him for the first-degree murder of his 2-year-old half-brother, David Galarraga, whom Christian had brutally beaten, fracturing the toddler's skull by slamming him head-first into a bookshelf with such force that it caused massive brain trauma and internal injuries, and then left suffering and dying on the floor of their Jacksonville home, while Christian played video games and his mother, Bianella Susana, waited 8 hours before taking the critically injured child to the hospital, where doctors tried desperately to save David's life, but the injuries were too severe and the delay too long, resulting in David's death 2 days later on March 29, 2011, making Christian, at age 12, the youngest person in Jacksonville's history to be charged with first-degree murder as an adult. Before we continue with this disturbing and complex case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. For the 2 years between Christian's arrest in March 2011 and his sentencing in March 2013, the case generated intense media attention and sparked passionate debate about juvenile justice, the treatment of children who commit violent crimes, and whether a 12-year-old boy, himself a victim of horrific abuse, neglect, and violence throughout his entire short life, should be tried and sentenced as an adult for first-degree murder, or whether he was a damaged child who deserved treatment and rehabilitation rather than decades in adult prison. Christian had maintained throughout the proceedings an attitude of defiant hostility that masked deep psychological damage and trauma, an attitude that culminated in a shocking moment during his sentencing hearing, when Christian, apparently convinced that his age would protect him from serious consequences and frustrated by the proceedings, made an obscene gesture toward Judge Cooper. Accounts vary, with some witnesses reporting he flipped off the judge, while others described him making other disrespectful gestures and muttering profanities under his breath, behavior that instantly transformed the judge's demeanor from measured consideration of Christian's difficult circumstances to stern recognition that despite his youth and traumatic background, Christian posed a serious danger and showed disturbing lack of remorse or understanding of the gravity of what he had done. What Christian fundamentally failed to understand in that moment, what his traumatized, underdeveloped brain and his lifetime of learning that violence and disrespect were normal couldn't let him grasp, was that showing such blatant disrespect to the judge who held his future in her hands would have devastating consequences, that Judge Cooper had been considering giving him a more lenient sentence based on his age and circumstances, but that his courtroom behavior demonstrated exactly what prosecutors had been arguing, that Christian was an extremely troubled, potentially dangerous youth who lacked the remorse, impulse control, and respect for authority necessary to benefit from rehabilitation in the juvenile system. When Judge Cooper pronounced her sentence after witnessing Christian's disrespectful behavior, a modification of the original adult prosecution to a plea deal that would keep Christian in the juvenile system until age 19, but with strict conditions and the possibility of adult prison if he violated terms of his supervision, ultimately resulting in Christian serving time in juvenile facilities followed by years of restrictive probation. The reality of what his actions in court had cost him seemed to register on Christian's face, the defiant scowl crumbling into tears as he realized he would spend the next 7 years of his life locked up, missing his entire adolescence, paying for both the murder of his half-brother and for the disrespect he had shown to the authority of the court. Christian Fernandez was born on January 14, 1999, in Miami, Florida, into circumstances so horrific and traumatic that they would shape every aspect of his development and contribute directly to the violence he would eventually inflict on his half-brother. Christian's mother, Bianella Susana, sometimes spelled Bianella Marie Susana in court records, was only 14 years old herself when she gave birth to Christian, a child having a child, entirely unprepared for the responsibilities of motherhood, still dealing with her own trauma and abuse, and involved with an older teenage father who would prove to be violent and dangerous. Christian's biological father was involved in Christian's life for only a brief period, but that period was characterized by violence. According to court records and investigation reports, when Christian was approximately 2 years old, his father brutally beat him, causing severe injuries including a skull fracture that required hospitalization. The abuse was so severe that Child Protective Services intervened, and Christian's father was eventually arrested and charged. However, before he could face trial for the abuse, Christian's father was murdered, shot to death in Miami when Christian was just a toddler, leaving Christian with no memory of him except the physical and psychological scars from the abuse he had inflicted. This early trauma, being severely beaten by his father at age 2, suffering a skull fracture, experiencing the chaos of his father's murder, occurred during critical developmental periods when Christian's brain was forming neural pathways for emotional regulation, attachment, and understanding of violence. Child development experts would later testify that trauma at this age can cause permanent changes in brain structure and function, particularly in areas governing impulse control, empathy, and the ability to regulate emotions, all deficits that Christian would display throughout his childhood, and that would contribute to his eventual violence toward his half-brother. After Christian's father was murdered, Bianella struggled to care for Christian as a teenage single mother with minimal support, resources, or parenting skills. She had relationships with multiple men, some of whom were involved in criminal activity, some of whom were abusive toward Bianella and toward Christian. Christian witnessed domestic violence regularly, saw drug use and criminal activity in his home, experienced instability as Bianella moved frequently and struggled to maintain housing and employment. When Christian was approximately 8 years old in 2007, another traumatic event occurred that would further damage his psychological development. Bianella's boyfriend at the time sexually abused Christian. Court records indicate the abuse occurred on multiple occasions over a period of months before being discovered. When the abuse was finally reported, Child Protective Services removed Christian from Bianella's custody and placed him in foster care while investigations and prosecutions proceeded. Christian spent approximately 2 years in the foster care system, being moved between multiple placements, experiencing the additional trauma of being separated from his mother and siblings, never forming stable attachments with foster parents or finding a sense of safety and permanence. During his time in foster care, Christian displayed increasingly concerning behaviors. He was aggressive toward other children in foster placements, had violent outbursts and tantrums, showed cruelty toward animals, and demonstrated the kind of reactive attachment disorder and conduct problems that mental health professionals recognize as warning signs of serious psychological disturbance. Christian received some counseling and therapy during this period, but the interventions were limited and inconsistent, hampered by the reality that Christian was being moved between placements and never stayed with therapists long enough to form therapeutic relationships or make meaningful progress. Around 2009, when Christian was approximately 10 years old, Child Protective Services made the decision to return him to Bianella's custody. The man who had sexually abused Christian was no longer in the picture. He had been prosecuted and was serving time for his crimes, and Bianella had completed mandated parenting classes and other services that convinced CPS she was ready to parent Christian effectively. But this decision, made with good intentions by an overwhelmed child welfare system dealing with too many cases and too few resources, would prove catastrophic. Christian returned to his mother's home deeply damaged, carrying trauma from his father's abuse, from witnessing his father's murder, from the sexual abuse he had suffered, from years in unstable foster placements. He had never received adequate treatment for these traumas, had never learned healthy ways to cope with anger or regulate emotions, had internalized violence as normal, and had developed the belief that he was worthless and that causing pain to others was acceptable. And he was returning to a mother who, despite completing parenting classes, remained ill-equipped to provide the intensive structure, therapy, and support Christian desperately needed. In the 2 years between Christian's return to Bianella's custody and the murder of his half-brother, Christian's behavior became increasingly concerning. He was aggressive at school, frequently suspended for fighting and threatening other students. At home, he was violent toward his younger siblings. Bianella had other children, including David Galarraga, born in 2009, and other half-siblings from different fathers. Neighbors and teachers expressed concerns about Christian's violence and the chaotic conditions in Bianella's home, but interventions were minimal. Most disturbingly, court records would later reveal that Christian had sexually abused one of his younger siblings, behavior that he had learned from the abuse perpetrated against him, perpetuating a cycle of violence and victimization. This abuse had occurred on multiple occasions, but was not discovered until after David's murder, when investigations into Christian's family situation uncovered the full extent of dysfunction and violence in the home. 2-year-old David Galarraga was Christian's half-brother, one of several children Bianella had with different fathers in the years after Christian's birth. David was a toddler in March 2011, living in the small Jacksonville apartment with Bianella, Christian, and other siblings, navigating a home environment characterized by chaos, violence, and inadequate supervision. On March 27, 2011, a Saturday, Bianella made a decision that would have fatal consequences. She left 12-year-old Christian in charge of watching David and the other younger children while she went out. Leaving a 12-year-old in charge of toddlers is questionable judgment under any circumstances. But leaving Christian, a deeply disturbed child with documented violence problems and poor impulse control, in charge was catastrophically dangerous. But Bianella either didn't recognize the danger or didn't care, prioritizing whatever errand or activity she was attending to over her children's safety. According to Christian's later statements to police and evidence presented at trial, David was being fussy and difficult that afternoon, crying and not listening to Christian's attempts to control his behavior. Christian became increasingly frustrated and angry. He had no skills for managing a difficult toddler, no patience or ability to regulate his own emotions when faced with the stress of David's crying. The exact sequence of events is known only to Christian, but the physical evidence and medical examination of David's injuries told a clear story. Christian had violently attacked the 2-year-old, culminating in Christian grabbing David and slamming him headfirst into a bookshelf with tremendous force. The impact fractured David's skull and caused severe brain trauma. David likely lost consciousness immediately or shortly after the impact. He would have been visibly severely injured, possibly bleeding, certainly unresponsive or minimally responsive, showing obvious signs of serious head trauma that would be apparent to anyone, even a 12-year-old. What Christian did next revealed his disturbing lack of empathy and understanding of consequences. Rather than immediately calling for help or trying to get medical attention for David, Christian simply left David lying on the floor, either unconscious or semi-conscious and suffering, and went back to what he had been doing, which court testimony suggested included playing video games and watching television. Christian did eventually call his mother to tell her that David was hurt, but he minimized the injury, describing it as David falling or bumping his head, rather than admitting he had violently assaulted the toddler. When Bianella returned home and saw David's condition, she could see the child was seriously injured. But rather than immediately calling 911 or rushing David to a hospital, the obvious and necessary response to a toddler showing signs of serious head injury, Bianella waited. Court records and testimony established that Bianella waited approximately 8 hours before finally taking David to the hospital, a delay that would prove fatal. During those 8 hours, David's brain was swelling, bleeding was occurring, and the injuries were progressing from potentially survivable to catastrophic. When Bianella finally brought David to the emergency room at St. Luke's Hospital in Jacksonville on the evening of March 27, 2011, medical staff immediately recognized this was a severe traumatic injury, not an accidental fall as Bianella initially claimed. David was in critical condition with massive brain trauma. Doctors performed emergency surgery to try to relieve pressure on David's brain and save his life, but the injuries were too severe and the delay in treatment had made recovery impossible. David Galarraga died on March 29, 2011, 2 days after Christian had slammed him into the bookshelf, another victim of the cycle of violence and neglect that characterized the Fernandez family. The medical examiner who performed David's autopsy determined that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head resulting in skull fracture and fatal brain injuries. The injuries were consistent with David being slammed into a hard surface or struck with a hard object with significant force. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. David had been killed by another person's violent actions, not by accident or natural causes. Jacksonville Sheriff's Office detectives immediately launched a homicide investigation. They interviewed Bianella, who initially claimed David had fallen or hurt himself while playing, but whose story kept changing and contained inconsistencies that raised red flags. Detectives interviewed Christian, who eventually admitted that he had pushed David, and David had hit the bookshelf, though he minimized his actions and claimed it was an accident. But as the investigation continued and more evidence emerged, detectives concluded that this was not an accident but a violent assault. The force required to cause David's catastrophic injuries was far more than a simple push. This was an intentional, violent act. Witnesses and evidence suggested Christian had a pattern of violence toward his younger siblings, and Christian's behavior after injuring David, leaving him suffering and not seeking immediate help, showed a disturbing indifference to David's welfare. On May 2, 2011, approximately 5 weeks after David's death, Christian Fernandez was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At age 12, Christian became the youngest person in Jacksonville's history to face adult first-degree murder charges. The decision to charge Christian as an adult rather than keeping his case in juvenile court was made by State Attorney Angela Corey, who cited the severity of the crime, the victim's young age and vulnerability, and Christian's history of violence, including the sexual abuse of another sibling, which had been discovered during the murder investigation and resulted in additional charges against Christian. The decision to charge a 12-year-old as an adult for first-degree murder sparked immediate and intense controversy. Child advocates, juvenile justice reform organizations, and many members of the public argued that prosecuting a child this young as an adult was cruel, ignored the extensive trauma and abuse Christian himself had suffered throughout his life, and represented a failure of the child welfare system that should have protected Christian, but instead had repeatedly failed him. They argued that Christian needed treatment and rehabilitation in therapeutic settings designed for traumatized youth, not adult prosecution and potential life in prison. But prosecutors and victims' advocates argued that the brutality of David's murder, Christian's pattern of violence, and the need to protect society from a dangerous individual justified adult prosecution. They pointed out that while Christian had certainly suffered trauma, many children experience trauma without becoming violent murderers, and that Christian's actions showed he posed an ongoing serious threat. Christian was held in juvenile detention while his case proceeded through the legal system. The case attracted national media attention, with news outlets covering the controversy about prosecuting such a young child as an adult, and advocates on both sides using Christian's case to argue their positions on juvenile justice policy. In addition to the murder charge, Christian was also charged with aggravated battery and sexual battery related to his abuse of another sibling. These additional charges, combined with the murder charge, meant Christian faced the possibility of life in prison if convicted in adult court. Florida law at the time allowed life sentences for juveniles convicted of murder, though subsequent Supreme Court rulings would modify these policies. Bianella Susana, Christian's mother, was also charged in connection with David's death. She was charged with aggravated manslaughter of a child based on her culpable negligence, specifically her decision to leave Christian in charge of David despite knowing about Christian's violence problems, and her 8-hour delay in seeking medical treatment for David after she returned home and saw he was seriously injured. Prosecutors argued that Bianella's actions and inactions directly contributed to David's death, and that she bore significant criminal responsibility. As Christian's case moved toward trial, his defense attorneys faced the difficult task of presenting a defense for a client whose guilt was fairly clear from the evidence, but whose youth, trauma history, and obvious psychological damage made him a sympathetic figure despite the horror of his crime. The defense strategy focused on arguing that Christian should not be tried as an adult, that his case should be transferred back to juvenile court, where he would face age-appropriate sanctions and have access to treatment and rehabilitation services. Defense experts presented testimony about Christian's extensive trauma history, the neurological damage likely caused by the skull fracture he suffered as a toddler when his father beat him, the psychological impact of the sexual abuse he had endured, and the failure of the child welfare system to provide him with adequate treatment and protection. They argued that Christian was himself a victim, that his violent behavior was a direct result of the violence and abuse he had experienced throughout his life, and that he needed treatment, not adult prison. Prosecutors countered with testimony about the brutality of David's murder, the vulnerability of the 2-year-old victim, Christian's pattern of violence including his sexual abuse of another sibling, and expert testimony suggesting that Christian showed signs of conduct disorder and possibly emerging antisocial personality traits that indicated he would remain dangerous even with treatment. In early 2013, after nearly 2 years of legal proceedings, plea negotiations intensified. Both sides recognized that taking the case to trial was risky. Prosecutors faced the challenge of convincing a jury to convict a 12-year-old of first-degree murder, while the defense faced the reality that the evidence of Christian's guilt was strong, and a conviction could result in life in prison. After extensive negotiations, a plea deal was reached. Under the terms of the plea agreement, Christian would plead guilty to second-degree murder, a reduction from the original first-degree murder charge, in David's death. In exchange for the guilty plea, prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence that would keep Christian in the juvenile system rather than sentencing him as an adult to prison. Specifically, the deal called for Christian to be held in secure juvenile detention until his 19th birthday, at which point he would be released to probation with strict conditions. If Christian violated the terms of his juvenile detention or his subsequent probation, he could be prosecuted as an adult and face additional prison time. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for March 20th, 2013. The hearing was expected to be emotional and contentious, with David's family members planning to deliver victim impact statements and with both sides presenting arguments about the appropriate sentence given Christian's youth, his crime, and his circumstances. The hearing began with victim impact statements from David's family members. Though specific details of these statements are not fully documented in public records, family members expressed their grief over David's death, their anger at how he had died, and their complex feelings about Christian, recognizing that he was himself a child and a victim of abuse, but also feeling that he needed to be held accountable for taking David's life. Throughout these emotional statements, witnesses reported that Christian showed minimal visible reaction. He sat at the defense table with a blank or defiant expression, not crying, not showing obvious remorse or emotional response to the family members describing the pain of losing David. This lack of visible emotion was noted by many in the courtroom and would become a factor in the judge's ultimate sentencing decision. When it came time for Christian to make any statement before sentencing, accounts of what exactly happened vary based on different witness descriptions, but multiple sources reported that Christian displayed disrespectful behavior toward Judge Cooper. Some accounts indicate he made an obscene gesture, flipping off the judge or making other rude hand gestures, while others reported he muttered profanities or made disrespectful comments under his breath loud enough to be heard. The exact nature of the disrespect is less important than the impact it had. Judge Cooper, who had been presiding over the proceedings with measured consideration of Christian's difficult circumstances, and who had been inclined to follow the plea agreement's recommendations, was visibly affected by Christian's courtroom behavior. Judge Cooper addressed Christian directly, her tone shifting from the careful consideration she had maintained throughout the proceedings to stern disapproval. "Mr. Fernandez," Cooper said, "you have shown throughout these proceedings a disturbing lack of remorse for what you did to your brother. Your behavior here today demonstrates exactly what the prosecution has been arguing, that despite your age and your difficult background, you show concerning antisocial traits and lack of respect for authority that make it unclear whether you can benefit from rehabilitation in the juvenile system." Judge Cooper continued, addressing the courtroom and explaining her reasoning. "This court recognizes that Christian Fernandez is himself a victim. He suffered horrific abuse as a young child. He was sexually assaulted. He was failed repeatedly by the systems that should have protected him. These facts are tragic and they help explain though they do not excuse, his violence toward his brother. But this court also must consider the victim in this case, David Galarraga, a 2-year-old child who died from injuries inflicted by the defendant. And this court must consider whether the defendant shows the capacity for remorse, for rehabilitation, for becoming a person who can someday safely be part of society. Then Judge Cooper pronounced her sentence, which adhered to the plea agreement, but made clear that Christian would be held to strict standards and that any violation would result in adult prosecution and prison. It is the sentence of this court that Christian Fernandez be committed to the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice secure detention until his 19th birthday for the second-degree murder of David Galarraga. Upon release at age 19, Mr. Fernandez will be subject to 8 years of probation with strict conditions including regular reporting, counseling, employment or education requirements, and prohibition on contact with minor children. Any violation of the terms of this probation will result in Mr. Fernandez being prosecuted as an adult and sentenced to additional prison time in the Florida Department of Corrections. As the weight of the sentence sank in, 7 years in secure juvenile detention, meaning Christian would remain locked up through his entire adolescence, missing his teenage years, confined in juvenile facilities until age 19, followed by 8 years of restrictive probation. Christian's defiant facade crumbled. His eyes filled with tears. His shoulders shook. For the first time throughout the proceedings, Christian began to cry, the reality of what his actions had cost him. Both the murder of David and his disrespectful behavior toward the judge, finally breaking through his defenses. Christian was led away by juvenile detention officers to begin his 7-year sentence. He would spend his 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th and 18th birthdays in secure juvenile facilities, receiving education and some therapeutic services, but living in locked facilities with other delinquent youth, separated from family and society, paying for the choice he had made at age 12 when he violently assaulted his 2-year-old brother and then failed to get him medical help. As of December 2025, Christian Fernandez is now 25 years old and has completed both his juvenile detention sentence and his subsequent probation period. He was released from juvenile detention in 2018 when he turned 19, having served 7 years for David's murder. He then served his probationary period through approximately 2026, during which he was required to regularly report to probation officers, participate in counseling, maintain employment or enrollment in education, and comply with strict conditions designed to ensure public safety and monitor his rehabilitation. Public information about Christian's current status is limited, as juvenile records are typically sealed, and individuals who complete their sentences have privacy rights. However, based on available information, Christian appears to have completed his sentence without major violations that would have triggered the adult prosecution and prison time that Judge Cooper warned about. Whether Christian has genuinely rehabilitated, developed remorse for David's death, and addressed his trauma and violence issues is known only to him, his therapists, and those close to him. The case of Christian Fernandez remains one of the most controversial juvenile justice cases in Florida history, raising profound questions about how society should respond when severely traumatized children commit violent crimes. Christian was undeniably a victim himself, abused by his father, sexually assaulted, failed by child protective services, never receiving adequate treatment for his trauma. But he was also undeniably a perpetrator who killed his 2-year-old brother and showed disturbing lack of remorse. The broader systemic failures in Christian's case are evident. Child protective services knew about the abuse and trauma Christian had experienced but failed to provide sustained intensive treatment that might have prevented his violence. Bianella Susana, despite completing mandated services, was never adequately supported or monitored as a parent struggling to care for a severely traumatized child. Warning signs about Christian's violence were reported by teachers and neighbors, but didn't trigger sufficient intervention. The system failed Christian, and that failure contributed directly to David's death. Yet recognizing these systemic failures doesn't eliminate Christian's responsibility for his actions. At age 12, he chose to violently assault David with enough force to fracture his skull. He then chose not to seek immediate help, instead leaving David suffering. And when faced with the consequences of those choices in Judge Cooper's courtroom, he chose to show disrespect rather than remorse, a choice that impacted his sentence and demonstrated to the judge exactly the concerning lack of empathy and respect for authority that prosecutors had been highlighting. The case sparked ongoing debate about trying juveniles as adults and about appropriate sentences for children who commit serious violent crimes. Advocates on one side argue that children like Christian, no matter how serious their crimes, should never be tried as adults and should receive sentences focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment, with the goal of addressing their trauma and helping them develop into functional adults. Advocates on the other side argue that extremely violent crimes, even when committed by children, require serious consequences both for public safety and for justice for victims. Christian's case also highlighted the crisis in the child welfare system. The lack of resources, the overwhelming caseloads, the insufficient therapeutic services for traumatized children. After Christian's case received national attention, some reforms were implemented in Florida's child welfare system, including increased focus on providing trauma-informed care to children in foster care and better assessment of children being returned to parents' custody after abuse investigations. For David Galarraga's family, no sentence or reform could bring David back or undo the pain of losing a 2-year-old to violence. David was a toddler when he died, with his whole life ahead of him, and he died because the systems that should have protected both him and Christian failed catastrophically. The family's victim impact statements at sentencing expressed not only grief for David, but also frustration at how preventable his death had been if appropriate interventions had occurred earlier in Christian's life. The question of whether Christian Fernandez is a success story of juvenile justice or a cautionary tale about the limits of rehabilitation remains unanswered. He completed his sentence without the violations that would have sent him to adult prison, suggesting some level of behavioral control and compliance with the system's requirements. Whether that compliance reflects genuine internal change, development of empathy, remorse, and pro-social values, or merely learned ability to avoid negative consequences is unclear. What is clear is that Christian's case demonstrates the devastating intergenerational effects of abuse, neglect, and trauma. Christian's father beat him severely as a toddler, potentially causing neurological damage that affected his development. Christian was then sexually abused, experiencing another layer of trauma. Living in chaotic, violent circumstances with inadequate parenting, Christian internalized violence as normal, and when left in charge of his toddler brother, Christian replicated the violence he had experienced, killing David in a brutal assault that mirrored the abuse Christian himself had suffered. Breaking these cycles of abuse and violence requires intensive, sustained intervention, not just mandated parenting classes or brief stints in therapy, but comprehensive support addressing trauma, providing stable environments, teaching emotional regulation and nonviolent conflict resolution, and ensuring children like Christian receive the treatment they desperately need before their trauma manifests as violence toward others. The moment when Christian flipped off or showed disrespect to Judge Cooper during his sentencing hearing, that brief moment of defiant disrespect, became emblematic of his case. It showed a 14-year-old boy. He was 12 when he killed David, but 14 by the time of sentencing, who despite 2 years in detention and extensive exposure to the consequences of his actions, still lacked the impulse control, respect for authority, and understanding of appropriate behavior that would be necessary for successful reintegration into society. That moment of disrespect may have influenced Judge Cooper's decision to emphasize the strict conditions of his probation and the consequences of any future violations, making clear that while Christian was receiving a juvenile sentence rather than adult prison, he would be held to high standards and monitored closely. And in that moment, as Judge Cooper made clear the strict terms of his sentence and warned about the adult prison time he would face if he violated probation, the reality appeared to hit Christian. The defiant scowl that had characterized his court appearances dissolved. Tears came. For the first time, Christian seemed to grasp that his choices had consequences, that his disrespect had cost him, that he would spend the next 7 years locked up missing his entire adolescence. Whether that moment represented genuine remorse and the beginning of rehabilitation, or merely fear of consequences, is something only Christian knows. But it stands as a stark reminder that in a courtroom, before a judge who holds your future in their hands, disrespect and defiance have immediate, crushing consequences. The 14-year-old who flipped off the judge instantly regretted it when the sentence was read, realizing too late that his behavior had eliminated any possibility of leniency and had confirmed every concern prosecutors had raised about his character and dangerousness. Christian Fernandez's story is ultimately a tragedy on multiple levels. Tragic that David Galarraga died at age 2 from violence inflicted by his brother. Tragic that Christian suffered such horrific abuse and neglect that shaped him into someone capable of that violence. Tragic that systems designed to protect children failed both boys so catastrophically, and tragic that only after a toddler was dead did anyone take seriously the urgent need for intervention and treatment that might have prevented the whole disaster. The case continues to be studied, debated, and cited in discussions of juvenile justice policy. It raises questions without easy answers about accountability, rehabilitation, trauma, and the point at which a child's victimization ends and their perpetration begins. And it serves as a reminder that courtroom behavior matters, that disrespecting the judge can have immediate devastating consequences, and that even young defendants facing serious charges must understand that how they conduct themselves in court will impact their sentence and their future. The boy who killed his toddler brother, who flipped off the judge at his sentencing hearing, who instantly regretted it when his 7-year sentence was read. That boy is now a man in his mid-20s trying to build a life in the shadow of his past. Whether he succeeded in rehabilitation, whether he developed genuine remorse and empathy, whether he broke the cycle of violence that defined his childhood, these questions remain largely unanswered. But his case stands as a permanent reminder of the devastating consequences of abuse, neglect, violence, and the failures of systems meant to protect the most vulnerable among us.